Imagine working the graveyard shift in a building so quiet you can hear the elevator cables sing, scrubbing marble floors that have never once known your name, when suddenly you turn the corner of a darkened executive suite and find the most powerful man in the city sitting on the floor with his back against a glass wall, holding a small folded photograph in two shaking hands, crying so silently that the only thing giving him away is the way his shoulders keep collapsing inward like something inside him is finally caving in. Now imagine he looks up. Imagine he sees you. And imagine that instead of the cold, calculating face the world has memorized from 1,000 magazine covers, he does something no human being alive has ever seen him do. Something his own mother never witnessed. Something his ex-wife swore he was incapable of. Something that will rewrite every assumption you ever had about who has it easy in this world and who is quietly drowning behind a $1,000 tie. Because the truth is, the loneliest people in this city don't sleep on benches. Some of them sleep at the top of the tallest buildings, in beds so soft they feel like punishment, with phones full of messages from people who only want pieces of them. And tonight, one of those men is about to be found. The clock above the freight elevator on the 40th floor of Halloran Tower clicked over to 1:53 in the morning, and Wren Mackenzie shifted the strap of her cleaning cart so it stopped digging into her shoulder. Her right wrist throbbed where she'd twisted it 3 nights ago, lifting a mop bucket the wrong way, and her sneakers, originally white in some forgotten lifetime, had taken on the soft gray of 1,000 floors. She liked the 40th floor. She liked all the floors above 35, actually, because the people who worked there had already gone home by the time her shift started, and the silence up here had a different texture from the silence on the lower floors. It was a richer silence, padded with thick carpets and double-glazed windows that turned the city outside into a soundless painting. Sometimes she pretended the offices were hers. She would push her cart past the corner suites and let herself glance, just for a second, at the framed degrees on the walls, at the leather chairs that probably cost more than her monthly rent, at the desks polished to the gleam of dark water. She never touched anything she wasn't supposed to. Wren Mackenzie had not been raised to touch what wasn't hers. But she was allowed to look, and looking was free, and free was a price she could afford. Tonight she had been on her feet since 9 in the evening, and she still had 4 more hours to go. She moved through the executive wing, with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned, very early in life, that being unseen was a form of survival. 26 years old. 5'4", a face her mother used to call stubborn pretty, with high cheekbones and a small chin and eyes the muted green of sea glass that had been worn smooth by years of being underestimated. Her dark hair was pulled back in a low knot at the nape of her neck, and her uniform, gray on gray with a small Halloran Building Services patch over the heart, fit her like something she had inherited rather than been issued. There was a coffee stain on her left cuff from an earlier accident. There was a hole forming at the elbow she had not yet found time to mend. There was a folded letter in her back pocket from the property management company that ran her apartment building, and the letter said that the rent was being raised by another $200 beginning the 1st of the month, and Wren had read that letter so many times in the past 2 days that the paper had gone soft at the creases. She was thinking about that letter as she rounded the corner into the long marble hallway that ran the length of the executive floor. She was thinking about her 7-year-old brother Theo, who slept in a bunk bed in the apartment they shared with their aunt, because their mother had died when Wren was 21, and their father had not been around for years before that. She was thinking about Theo's school shoes, which were a full size too small, and about how she had promised him a new pair this weekend, and about how the math of 1 new pair of school shoes and a $200 rent increase was a math she had not yet solved. She was so deep inside that arithmetic that she almost didn't see the light. Almost. It was the smallest seam of warm gold beneath the door of the corner suite at the very end of the hallway, the suite she had been told, in her very first week, never to clean, unless she was specifically asked. The suite belonged to Adrian Halloran himself. Adrian Halloran, the name that was etched into the brass plaque downstairs in the lobby, the name that was printed on the side of half the buildings between here and the river, the name that Wren had heard her supervisor whisper with a strange mix of reverence and fear during her orientation, telling her to never knock, never enter, never linger. Mr. Halloran's office, the supervisor had said, was off limits. Mr. Halloran came and went on his own time. Mr. Halloran did not exist for the cleaning staff, and the cleaning staff did not exist for Mr. Halloran, and that was the arrangement that worked best for everyone. And yet here was that golden seam of light, glowing under the door at 1:56 in the morning, where no light had any business being. Wren slowed her cart. She told herself she would walk past. She told herself it was none of her business. She had learned, after 26 years of being nobody's first priority, that minding your business was not a personality trait, but a survival tool, and she had honed it until it could cut glass. She walked past the door. She made it almost to the next corner. Then she heard the sound. It was so small, it was almost not a sound at all. It was the kind of sound you only hear if you have ever made it yourself, in the dark, with a pillow pressed over your face, so the children in the next room would not wake up. It was the sound of a grown person trying very hard not to cry, and failing. Wren stopped. She stood there, in the marble hallway with her cleaning cart and her bad wrist, and her letter from the property management company folded into her pocket, and she listened to a stranger break apart, on the other side of an expensive door. And the thing about Wren Mackenzie was, she had never, in her entire life, been able to walk away from that particular sound. She turned the cart around. She told herself she would just check. She told herself if he was alone, if he was hurt, if he needed a phone, if he needed water, she would help, and then she would leave, and they would both pretend it had never happened. She did not let herself think about losing her job. She did not let herself think about the fact that the man on the other side of that door owned not only the building but, in some abstract corporate sense, the very air she was breathing. She only let herself think about that sound, and about her mother, who used to say that the worst thing one human could do to another was hear them suffering, and pretend they had not. She raised her hand. She knocked, once, very softly, and the sound on the other side stopped. For a long moment there was nothing at all. Then a voice, low and scraped raw, said, "I told the night staff I wasn't to be disturbed." Wren swallowed. She thought about turning around. She thought, very briefly, about how easy it would be to just say, "Sorry, sir, wrong door," and push her cart back into the safety of her own invisibility. But there was something in the voice, something that was not anger, something that was much closer to the way Theo sounded when he had stayed up too late and was trying not to admit he was scared. Wren leaned her forehead, just for a second, against the cool wood of the door. "I'm not the night staff," she said. "I'm just the woman who cleans the floors. I heard something. I wanted to make sure you were okay. That's all." There was another long silence, and then, in a voice she would remember for the rest of her life, the most powerful man in the city said, "Very quietly, please. Come in." She pushed the door open, and the first thing she saw was the city. The whole eastern half of it, laid out behind a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass like a blanket of cold stars, the river a black ribbon running through the middle of it, the bridges threaded with their tiny necklaces of light. The office was dim. Only a single lamp was on, low and golden, in the far corner, and it was that lamp that had thrown the seam of warmth she had seen beneath the door. The room smelled faintly of leather and old paper and something else, something darker and more expensive, like a cologne that had been worn so many hours ago it had become a memory of itself. And then, on the floor, with his back against the glass and his long legs stretched out in front of him on the carpet, was Adrian Halloran. He was 36 years old. She would learn that later. Tonight, he simply looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His suit jacket was thrown across the leather sofa, as though he had taken it off without looking. His tie hung loose around his neck. The top 2 buttons of his white shirt were undone, and his dark hair, which she had only ever seen in photographs, combed into a severe businesslike sweep, was tousled and falling into his eyes as though he had been running his hands through it for hours. He was holding a small folded photograph in his right hand, and a tumbler of something amber sat untouched on the carpet beside him. He looked up when she came in. His eyes were rimmed red, and the lashes around them were wet, and Ren had a sudden, vertiginous moment of feeling like she had walked into a room she had no permission to be in, like she had stumbled into a private room of a museum where the painting was a man instead of a portrait. She froze in the doorway. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched the practiced mask try to slide back over his face. She watched the jaw clench, watched the shoulders pull back, watched the cold, calibrated CEO try to reassemble himself in front of a stranger. And then, halfway through the rebuild, the mask cracked. He looked back down at the photograph in his hand. He shook his head once, very slowly, as if he could not quite believe what was happening, and he let out a small sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and he said, almost to himself, Of course it's like this." Ren did not move. She had been raised by a mother who taught her never to approach a wounded animal too fast, and her mother had also taught her that there were certain kinds of grief that could only stand to be witnessed, never touched, and that the wisdom of a good person lay in knowing the difference. She stood very still, and she waited. Adrian Halloran rubbed the back of his hand across his eyes. He looked up at her again, and this time his voice was steadier, though only just. "I'm sorry," he said. "You shouldn't have to see this. It was such a strange thing for a man like him to say. It was such a strange thing for any man with a name on a building to say to a woman with a cleaning cart." Ren felt something in her chest tilt sideways. "Mr. Halloran," she said carefully, "you don't owe me an apology." His mouth twitched. It was almost, but not quite, a smile. And yet he said, "You're the only person in this entire building I haven't already disappointed tonight." She did not know what to say to that. She had spent her whole working life in rooms with men who guarded their feelings the way other men guarded gold, and now she was being offered a sentence like that as if it were a cup of water in a desert. She set her cleaning cart against the wall. She took one careful step into the room. "Are you hurt?" she asked. He shook his head. "Are you sick?" Another shake. "Is there someone I should call?" He laughed then, a dry, terrible laugh, and he tipped his head back against the glass and closed his eyes. "There's no one," he said. "That's rather the point." The city behind him gleamed indifferent. Ren took another step. She kept her hands visible, palms slightly open at her sides, the way you might approach a child or a frightened dog. She crossed the long carpet toward him slowly, and when she was about 10 feet away, she stopped and lowered herself, very carefully, to sit on the floor with her back against the leg of his enormous mahogany desk. She did not sit close to him. She left an ocean of carpet between them. But she sat down, on the floor of the most powerful office in the building, in her gray uniform with the hole at the elbow, and she folded her hands in her lap and she said, "Then, I'll just stay a minute, until you're ready to be alone again. If that's all right." He opened his eyes. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. And then, slowly, with the careful motion of a man who is afraid he might break, Adrian Halloran did something nobody, in his entire life, had ever seen him do. He held out the small folded photograph in his right hand toward her, the photograph he had been clutching all night, the photograph he had not shown to a single living soul in 3 years, and he said, in a voice that was the wreckage of every speech he had ever given on every stage, in every glittering ballroom in this city. Would you like to know who I am? The real one, not the one on the magazines." Ren reached out across the carpet. Her fingers closed gently around the worn edge of the photograph. She turned it over. And the world she thought she knew. The world she had cleaned floors in for 2.5 years. The world that had told her exactly where she stood, quietly, completely, and forever rearranged itself. The photograph was creased in 4 places. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that the white lines of the creases had started to crack into the image itself, but you could still see what was there. A boy. Maybe 6 years old, hair the color of wet sand, eyes the same impossible gray as the man sitting against the glass. He was wearing a blue raincoat that was just a touch too big for him, and he was crouched on a sidewalk in front of a flower stand, smiling up at the camera with 2 missing front teeth, holding a small bunch of yellow tulips. On the back, in pen that had faded to a soft brown, someone had written, "For Daddy, so you smile today. Love, Henry." Ren held the photograph very gently between her thumb and finger. She did not need to ask. The boy had Adrian Halloran's eyes. She looked up. He was watching her watch the picture, and his face was so naked in that moment that she had to look back down at the tulips and the missing teeth and the careful, looping handwriting of a child who had not yet learned the letters of his own grief. His name was Henry, Adrian said. He said it in the past tense. He said it the way you say a word, in a language you used to speak fluently and have not used in years. His mother and I were divorced when he was 3. We weren't right together. We had never been right together. We had married because it was what people like us did, and we had stayed married because it was what people like us did, and we had had a child because it was what people like us did, and we had hurt each other in a great many quiet, civilized ways until one afternoon she sat down across from me at our breakfast table and told me that we were going to stop pretending. And I was grateful. God help me, I was grateful. He stopped. He breathed in slowly. "We made it work," he said. After. We made it work for Henry. He stayed with her during the week, with me on weekends. I would pick him up on Friday afternoons. I would take him to the park, to museums, to the bookstore on 10th Street, to the diner that had the strawberry pancakes he liked. I had not been a particularly good husband. I had not even been a particularly good father, in the beginning. But after the divorce, I tried. I tried so hard. I would cancel meetings. I would fire people who pushed back on my schedule. I learned the names of all his stuffed animals. I learned the way he liked his toast cut. I learned for the first time in my life what it felt like to love something more than I cared about being right. Outside, far below, a single siren wound through the streets and faded. 3 years ago, he said, his mother was driving him home from a birthday party on a Saturday afternoon. It was raining. The road was slick. Another driver came through a red light at an intersection on Madison. He was 22 years old. He was looking at his phone. The police would tell me, later, that there was no way she could have braked in time. They would tell me, also, that it would have been instantaneous, that neither of them would have known. They told me that, as if it were a kindness, as if it would help. Ren felt tears slip silently down her own cheeks before she even knew she was crying. She did not wipe them away. She did not want him to see her notice she was crying, in case it made him stop. He was 6 years old, Adrian said. He had given me that photograph the weekend before. He had taken it himself, with his little plastic camera, at a flower stand we passed on the way home. He had asked me, in the car, whether I would put it on my desk so that when I was at work I could look up and see flowers and remember to smile. And I said yes. I said I would. And then I put it in my wallet because I thought I would keep it close. And then the accident happened, and I never put it on my desk. Because every time I tried, I could not bear it. 3 years later, and I cannot bear it. He pressed the heel of his hand against his mouth, hard, and for a long time he could not speak. Ren did not move. She held the photograph in her lap with the careful reverence of someone holding a sleeping child. Today, he said finally, would have been his 9th birthday. He would have been 9 years old today. The number landed in the room like a stone in still water. And I have spent the last 14 hours, Adrian said, sitting at this desk, signing contracts and approving acquisitions and shaking hands with a board of investors, smiling for photographs, accepting congratulations on the quarterly numbers, while my son, who would have been 9 years old today, has been in the ground for 3 years and 7 months and 11 days, and nobody, not one single person in this entire building has said his name. His voice broke on the last word, and he looked up at her, and his eyes were so full of 3 years of unwept tears that Ren felt her own chest cave in around the weight of them. And Adrian Halloran, whose name was on the side of the building, whose face was on the cover of magazines, whose fortune was so vast that the city named streets after his charities, looked at a woman in a gray uniform with a hole at the elbow and a stained cuff and a property management letter in her back pocket, and he said, very quietly, "Would you say his name? Please, just once. Out loud, I just need to hear someone say it." Ren Mackenzie understood many things at once. She understood that this was not a moment for advice. She understood that this was not a moment for comfort, for solutions, for the soft murmured platitudes that strangers offer the bereaved. She understood that this was a moment when a man who had everything was asking her for one small thing she could give him for free. She lifted the photograph. She held it up, gently, where he could see it, where the lamplight could catch the wet shine of the boy's smile, and she said, in a voice that was steady and soft and warm and absolutely her own, "Henry. His name is Henry. And he had your eyes. And he loved you. And today, he would have been 9. Adrian Halloran closed his eyes. A single tear slipped out from beneath his lashes and traveled, slowly, all the way down his cheek and disappeared into the dark line of his jaw. He did not wipe it away. And in that office, on the 40th floor of the most expensive building in the city, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the most powerful man Ren had ever met in her life made a sound she would carry with her for as long as she lived. He let himself cry. Not silently. This time. Not folded inward. He cried the way Henry might have cried as a child, the way grief is supposed to come out of a body when nobody is keeping score, in long, shuddering sobs that rolled out of him and broke against the glass and shook the broad line of his shoulders until they were finally still. Ren did not move. She sat 10 feet away on a carpet that cost more than her car, and she let him weep, and she held the photograph of his son in her lap, and she did the only thing she knew how to do when someone was drowning in front of her. She stayed. Time stopped meaning what it meant. Outside, the city kept its small, distant noises. Eventually, after what might have been 10 minutes, or might have been an hour, Adrian Halloran lifted his head. His face was wet, his eyes were swollen, and he looked, somehow, 10 years younger than he had when she walked in. He looked at her across the carpet. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, because there was nothing to say. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ren," she said. "Ren Mackenzie." He repeated it, "Ren." Then he said, more quietly, "Ren, I want you to know something. I have known a great many people in my life. I have been surrounded every day by people who claim to know me, and not a single one of them has ever said his name out loud in this room. Do you understand what you just did for me?" She did not, entirely, but she nodded anyway, because she thought she understood enough. He looked at her for a long, long moment. "Will you do me one more kindness?" he asked. She waited. "Will you let me drive you home tonight when your shift is over? Not because I owe you. not because I want anything from you. Just because I do not want to be alone for the rest of this night, and I have a feeling that you are the only person in this city who would understand that, without making it mean something it doesn't mean. Ren Mackenzie sat on the carpet of a billionaire's office at 2 o'clock in the morning with the photograph of his dead son in her lap, and she thought of her aunt asleep in their tiny apartment in the borough across the river, and her brother in his 2 small school shoes, and the letter in her back pocket, and the bus she would otherwise take home at 6 a.m. Through the gray dawn, and she said the word that would, although neither of them knew it yet, begin to rebuild 2 lives that had been broken in completely different ways. Yes, she said. It was almost dawn when she finished her shift. Adrian had told her, in that quiet, almost shy voice that did not match anything she had ever read about him, that he would wait downstairs in the lobby, and that she should not feel rushed, and that if she changed her mind about the ride he would understand, and there would be no awkwardness at the building tomorrow. He had stood up. He had folded the photograph of his son with the same reverence with which a priest folds a vestment, and he had slipped it back into his wallet. He had put on his suit jacket. He had wiped his face with the back of his hand, and he had looked, briefly, like the man on the magazine covers again, except that nothing about his eyes was the same anymore. And then he had walked her to the door of his own office and held it open for her, as if she were the guest and he were the help, and Ren had pushed her cart back out into the marble hallway in a kind of stunned silence that did not break until she was 3 floors down. She finished her last rooms on autopilot. She mopped, she emptied bins, she wiped down conference tables, she sprayed glass, she dusted, she vacuumed. She did it all with her hands, while her mind was 40 floors above her, sitting on a carpet beside a man who had asked her to say a boy's name out loud. When she finally clocked out at 6:15 and walked through the lobby with her coat thrown over her uniform, he was there. He was leaning against a pillar near the revolving doors, his hands deep in the pockets of a charcoal overcoat, his hairfinger combed back into something almost respectable, his face arranged into something polite and contained. The night security guard at the front desk, a kind older man named Ernesto, with whom Ren had exchanged small smiles for 2 years, looked back and forth between them with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided, professionally, never to be surprised by anything. Adrian straightened when he saw her. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. They walked out into the cold blue dawn together. There was a black car at the curb, the kind of car that did not have a name, and a driver in a gray cap stood beside it, holding the rear door open. Adrian gestured her in first. She slid across the leather seat, and he slid in after her, and the door closed and shut out the city, and they sat side by side in a silence that was new and strange and not, somehow, uncomfortable. "Where are we going?" he asked. She told him the cross streets. A bridge, a borough, a neighborhood, an apartment she shared with her aunt and her brother, walls thin enough that you could hear the upstairs neighbor's television through the ceiling. He nodded to the driver. The car pulled away from the curb. The street lamps were still on, but the sky above them was beginning to turn that strange, unnameable color between night and morning, the color that has no name in any language she knew of. Ren looked at her hands in her lap. They were chapped from disinfectant. There was a small scar across the knuckle of her ring finger from a kitchen accident when she was 19. She thought about how strange it was that the most lavish car she had ever ridden in was carrying her home to a place where the radiator banged every morning at 6. Adrian spoke first. "I haven't slept in 3 nights, he said, conversationally. She turned her head. He was looking out the window at the river as they crossed the bridge. "Birthdays are bad," he said. "I always know they're coming, and I always think I'll be ready, and I never am. 2 nights ago, I tried to work through it. I sat at my desk and signed papers until my hand cramped. Last night, I went to a gala that the company had sponsored. I let 3 different women try to flirt with me at the bar. I gave a speech about the future of urban housing. I came home, and I poured a drink, and I poured another drink, and I did not sleep. And then, today happened. And tonight, I went back to the office, because the office is the only place I know how to be alone, without feeling lonely. Until you knocked. Ren did not know what to say. She had not been raised to know what to say to a man like this, on a morning like this, in a car like this. So she said the only true thing she could think of. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry about Henry. I'm sorry you've been alone with it." He turned his head and looked at her, the eastern light finally finding its way through the gap between two buildings, caught the side of his face and lit up the wet trace of where a tear had dried. "You have a child," he said. It was not a question. She shook her head. "A brother," she said. "He's 7. His name is Theo. I've been raising him with my aunt since our mother passed." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "He's lucky," he said. "I don't know what we'd have done without my aunt." "He's lucky," Adrian repeated, more firmly. "I can tell." She did not know how he could tell. She felt heat climb the side of her neck. The car turned off the bridge, into the streets she knew. The bodegas, the laundromats, the bus stops, the school where Theo went, the apartment building with the green awning where Ren's whole world lived. The driver pulled up to the curb in front of her building. Ren reached for the door handle. Adrian put his hand, very lightly, on the sleeve of her coat. "Ren," he said. She looked at him. "I will probably regret this tomorrow," he said, "because tomorrow I will go back to being the man on the magazine covers, and you will go back to being a stranger I had no business unburdening on. But before that happens, before this morning ends, I want to ask you something. And you are allowed to say no. You are allowed to say nothing. You are allowed to forget I ever spoke. Do you understand?" She nodded. "There is a foundation in Henry's name," he said. "I established it after the accident. We fund grief counseling for families who have lost children, transportation for parents who cannot afford to attend hospital appointments, scholarships for siblings of children who have died. The foundation is run, on paper, by a board of executives. It is operated, in practice, by people who have never lost anyone. I have not been able to bring myself to be involved in any way that requires me to say his name out loud, and so the foundation has become, in 3 years, exactly what I never meant it to become. A line item. A press release. A photo opportunity for me to skip." He paused. The car idled at the curb. "I would like, very much, to make it what I always meant it to be. And to do that, I think I am going to need to be able to walk into a room and say the word Henry without coming apart. I do not think I can learn how to do that alone. I have tried, for 3 years, alone, and you can see how it has gone." Ren waited. She did not know what he was asking. He looked at her, and his voice softened. "I am not asking you to fix me. I am not asking you to be my therapist or my friend or anything else that comes with a complicated set of expectations. I am asking, very humbly, if you would be willing to have coffee with me, one time, this week, somewhere public, somewhere safe for you, and let me ask you a few questions about how a person whose first instinct is not to run from someone else's pain learned how to be that way. Because I think the foundation needs a person like that on the inside of it. Not on paper. In practice. And I do not know how to find a person like that without insulting them by offering them money. I do not even know if you want to be found." He stopped. He let his hand fall away from her sleeve. "If you say no, I will give you my private number in case you ever need anything. I will instruct security to make sure you are never bothered. I will, if you wish it, ensure that we never see each other again. And I will mean every word of that." Ren sat there in the back seat of a car worth more than her aunt's annual salary, and she looked at the dashboard, and she looked at her chapped hands, and she thought about the letter in her back pocket, and she thought about Henry, who had looked up at a camera at 6 years old with 2 missing front teeth, And she thought about her own mother, who had died in a bed too narrow for her. And she thought, against all of her training, and against all of the careful self-protection she had learned over 26 years, that she did not want to say no. She nodded once. "Coffee," she said. "Yes. One time. We'll see." He let out a breath like he had been holding it for half a city. "Thank you," he said. Then, after a moment, "May I have your number? Or, if you would prefer, you may have mine. Whatever feels safer." She took his number. She wrote it on the back of a receipt she found at the bottom of her coat pocket. She got out of the car. He did not get out. He did not walk her to the door. He understood. She would later realize exactly what he was and exactly what she was not, and he did not perform for her. She walked across the cracked sidewalk in the cold blue morning and let herself into her building with her own key. She did not look back, but all the way up the stairs, all 4 flights of them, she could feel the small folded photograph of a boy in a blue raincoat in the front pocket of her chest, the way you carry something you have not earned and have no idea yet what to do with. The radiator was banging when she walked in. Theo was already up, sitting at the kitchen table in his pajamas, eating dry cereal out of a plastic bowl. Her Aunt Imelda was at the stove, stirring oatmeal. They both looked up at her. "You're glowing," her aunt said suspiciously. Wren walked past them both. She kissed the top of Theo's head. She poured herself a glass of water. She did not, for 1 second, know how to answer. The first coffee, on the following Wednesday, did not change Wren Mackenzie's life. She would remember that, later, with a small private smile. It was just coffee. He chose a quiet, deeply ordinary diner on the corner of Wren's block, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a chalkboard list of pies, and a waitress named Dot, who had been there since before either of them was born. He arrived in jeans, Adrian Halloran, in jeans. Wren had not known he owned jeans. He arrived early. She arrived 7 minutes late because the bus had been slow, and when she walked in he stood up at the booth as if she were the only person who had ever walked into a diner anywhere, and Dot the waitress raised one painted eyebrow at Wren behind his back, and Wren ignored her with all the dignity she could find. They sat. They ordered. He asked for black coffee and an English muffin. She asked for tea, because her stomach was so nervous she could not have held coffee down. They talked. They did not that first morning talk about Henry. They talked about Theo. They talked about Wren's aunt, who had immigrated from Manila when she was 20 and had cleaned houses for 30 years and now ran a small daycare out of their living room 3 afternoons a week. They talked about how Wren had been 3 semesters into a sociology degree when her mother got sick, and how she had not yet found a way back to finishing it, although she still kept her old textbooks in a milk crate under her bed. He listened. He listened the way a man listens when he has been alone for a long time and has not had the chance to be curious about another human being in a way that did not require him to pretend. After an hour, he paid the bill. He left a $50 tip on a $12 check. Wren saw it, and her stomach turned, briefly, into something complicated. He stood at the door of the diner, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he said, "May I see you again?" She thought about Dot the waitress, and about the cracked sidewalk outside, and about her Aunt Imelda's suspicious eyes that morning, and she thought about Henry's small, careful handwriting. She nodded. The second coffee, the following week, lasted 2 hours. He told her, that morning, about Henry's favorite book. It was a picture book about a small bear who could not find his hat. He told her how Henry had laughed in a particular high giggle whenever the bear, on the 3rd page, suspected a rabbit of the theft. He told her how he had read that book on the floor of his own bedroom 3 weeks after the funeral, alone, in the middle of the night, weeping, until he could not see the page anymore. He told her how he had not been able to read it since. He did not, that morning, ask her to fix anything. He just told her. The 3rd coffee turned into a walk. The fourth coffee turned into a long evening in a public park, where he showed her on his phone a presentation about Henry's foundation, and she sat on a bench in her old wool coat and asked him questions that nobody had ever thought to ask him before. Where were the families finding out about the grief counseling? How did the parents who could not afford the transportation know to apply? Had anyone ever sat with a sibling in the waiting room of a hospital and asked them what they needed? In their own words, in their own language, at their own age. Adrian Halloran, who had grown 3 multi-billion-dollar companies through the sheer force of asking the right question at the right table, sat on a park bench beside a woman who cleaned floors and discovered that he had been, for 3 years, asking all the wrong questions about the one thing in his life that mattered most. The fifth meeting was no longer a coffee. It was a Sunday afternoon. He came to the apartment. He brought a coloring book for Theo, the kind they sold at every drugstore for $4, because Wren had told him explicitly that anything expensive would be returned. He sat on her aunt's small floral couch, in his jeans again, and he ate the calamansi glazed chicken her aunt had made and complimented it 3 times until her aunt waved him away with embarrassed pleasure, and he answered every question Theo asked him without ever once condescending, and he did not, for a single second, behave as if there were anything strange about a billionaire eating dinner on a vinyl tablecloth in a 4th-floor walk-up in a borough his peers only crossed through on the way to weekend houses. When he left that evening, Imelda turned to Wren in the kitchen and said, in the same dry voice she used for everything important, "That is not a man who is dating you, Anak. That is a man who is asking, very politely, to be allowed inside your life. You should know the difference before you find out the hard way." Wren did not answer her aunt. She did not know what the answer was. She did not know what the answer would be for a long time yet. But she knew, after that 5th meeting, that Adrian Halloran had become, against every probability the world contained, a person whose name she said out loud in her own kitchen, without realizing it, the way you eventually say the names of people who belong to your daily life. She started, very slowly, to work with the foundation. Officially, she was a community liaison consultant, a title he had invented to make the paperwork bearable. Practically, she sat in on board meetings, sat with families in waiting rooms, sat across from social workers, and asked them the questions Adrian had not known to ask. She did not quit her cleaning job. She refused, with a fierce and unblinking pride, to do that. She did not let him pay her too much, and she did not let him pay her at all unless every other community liaison consultant at every other foundation in the city was paid the same. She kept her uniform, and her cart, and her shifts, and her aunt's apartment, and Theo, and the bus ride at 6 in the morning. She kept her own life. She kept the parts of herself she had earned. And in those weeks, in the small grace of those careful coffees and quiet phone calls and long Sunday dinners on a floral couch, Adrian Halloran began to speak Henry's name out loud in boardrooms. He cried, the first time. There were 5 executives in the room and he cried, and not one of them looked away. Because Wren had told him, very quietly the day before, that the people who could not bear to witness his grief were not the people who deserved to build a foundation in his son's name. That was the first time. It got easier. It did not get easy. But it got easier. What no one had warned Wren about, and what Wren herself had been too naive to predict, was that the world Adrian Halloran lived in did not allow new people to enter quietly. The first whisper came in the form of a photograph that appeared on a tabloid website 3 months after the night in his office. It was taken with a long lens through the diner window, where they had eaten that first English muffin together. The headline above it was vulgar, of course. The body of the article speculated, of course. A mystery brunette, the article called her, dressed down, possibly an aspiring actress, possibly a struggling artist, who had been seen on multiple occasions in the company of the famously private real estate magnate, Adrian Halloran. Wren read the article on her phone on the bus, on the way to her shift. Her face went hot. Her hands went cold. She thought about Theo, who could not yet read a tabloid headline, and about her aunt who could, and about Ernesto the security guard, who would now see her in a completely different way, and about every woman she had ever worked alongside in a cleaning uniform, who would now, very fairly, wonder. She did not call Adrian. She did not text him. She got off the bus. She walked to the building. She clocked in. She did her shift. At 1:15 in the morning, she was wheeling her cart down the long marble hallway of the 40th floor when she rounded the corner and stopped. He was sitting on the carpet outside the door of his own office, in jeans, his back against the wall, his knees up, his eyes red again. He looked up when he saw her. "I came to apologize," he said, "in person. I would not let myself send a text or call. I did not want to make this easier on myself than it deserves to be." She stood very still. "I knew this might happen," he said. "I had not adequately prepared you for it. I should have. The blame is mine. If you would like to walk away from all of this right now, with no consequences whatsoever, with the foundation continuing to pay your consultancy through the end of the year, with my personal guarantee that no one in my organization will ever again contact you, I would understand entirely. I came here tonight because I owed you the chance to make that decision in person, to my face, where I could not protect myself from your answer." Ren put down her cart. She walked to him. She lowered herself to sit on the carpet across from him in the hallway, 10 feet away, the same distance she had sat from him the first night. She looked at him for a long moment. "Adrian," she said. He waited. "Are you sorry the article happened? Or are you sorry you brought me into a life where the article was always going to happen?" His mouth opened. He closed it again. He took a long breath. "Both," he said honestly. "But the second one most of all." She nodded. "Then we need a third option," she said. "Not me leaving. Not you protecting me from this by paying me to disappear. A third option, where I get to decide what I am to you, and you get to decide what you are to me, and we tell that to the world together before they make it up for us. Because I will not, Adrian, be a mystery brunette. I refuse. I am a person. I am a person with a name, and a brother, and an aunt, and a job, and a life. And if I am going to be in your life, I am going to be in it as Ren Mackenzie, and the world is going to learn how to spell that, and I am not going to spend the rest of this strange and unexpected friendship hiding inside diner booths." He stared at her, and then, in the long marble hallway on the 40th floor of his own building, Adrian Halloran laughed. It was a real laugh. It was a shocked, broken open, almost young laugh. It was, Ren realized, the first laugh she had ever heard come out of him. "Ren Mackenzie," he said. "Adrian Halloran, I would like, very much, to be a person in your life. Officially. On the record. With your full name spelled correctly. And I would like also to be the kind of person who can show up at a fundraiser in something other than a borrowed dress, because if I show up in a borrowed dress, the tabloids will write that too, and you will be embarrassed for me, and I do not wish to be the source of any further embarrassment to you. Ever." She looked at him steadily. "Then we'll buy a dress. One dress. With my consultancy paycheck. Not yours. And we will go to a fundraiser together, and you will introduce me by name, and you will say what I do for the foundation, and you will not, under any circumstances, behave as if I am someone you are sneaking. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was rough. "I will not be embarrassed of you. I will not be embarrassed of my brother, of my aunt, of where I live, of where I work, of any single thing about my life. And if you, Adrian, at any point feel embarrassed of any of those things, then you will tell me, immediately, and I will go back to cleaning your floors at night, and we will both pretend none of this ever happened. I will never," he said, "be embarrassed of any single thing about you." "Then we have a plan," Ren said. They sat in silence for another moment. Then Adrian Halloran said, very quietly, almost shyly, "Ren?" "Yes, Henry would have liked you." She smiled. She felt her eyes sting. I would have liked him too, she said. Tell me again about the bear book. The fundraiser was 3 weeks later. Wren wore a dark green dress she had bought, herself, at a sample sale in the garment district, and she wore the only pair of heels she owned, and she pinned her hair up with her grandmother's silver comb, and she walked into a ballroom full of women and jewelry that cost more than her building, and she did not, for a single moment, flinch. Adrian introduced her by name at every table. This is Wren Mackenzie, who is helping us rebuild the Henry Halloran Foundation from the inside out. Some of them shook her hand warmly. Some of them shook her hand coolly. One of them, a thin woman in pearl gray with a face like a closed door, looked at her and said, without bothering to lower her voice, that it was so wonderful that Adrian was finally giving back to the community. Wren smiled the way she had learned to smile, at 26 years old, in 1,000 rooms where she had not been wanted, and she said, very pleasantly, that Adrian was not the one giving back, that the foundation was, and that the foundation belonged to the families it served, and that she was just very lucky to be allowed to learn from them. The woman in pearl gray was, it would later turn out, Adrian Halloran's mother. Her name was Cordelia. She did not approve. She did not approve of the dark green dress, or the silver comb, or the cleaning job, or the 4th floor walk up, or the diner where her son had been photographed, or the boroughs in general. She did not approve, in particular, of the way Adrian, in the middle of his speech at the podium, looked across the ballroom at Wren and said, into the microphone, I want to thank one person in particular tonight. A person who has reminded me of what this foundation is supposed to be, and of what my son's name is supposed to mean. Wren Mackenzie. Stand up, Wren, please. I will not pretend you are not here. Wren stood. There was scattered applause. Cordelia Halloran did not clap. Wren did not care. She sat back down. After the fundraiser, when the cars were lining up at the valet, Cordelia caught her arm. A word, my dear, she said. They stepped aside, under the awning, in the cold. Cordelia's hand was bony and cold, and weighted with one enormous ring. You seem like a very practical young woman, Cordelia said quietly. So I will be practical with you. My son has been through more than any human being should bear. He is fragile. He is not, currently in his right mind. He latches onto things, and people when he is grieving, and he will discard them again when he is not. I have seen it happen before. I have watched 2 of his marriages collapse this way. I am therefore going to make you an offer, and I am going to make it once, and I am going to expect a yes or a no by the end of this week. I will pay you, in cash, a sum that will allow your brother to attend a private school of your choosing and your aunt to retire comfortably, in exchange for your departure from my son's life. You will resign from the foundation. You will return to your former job, with a glowing reference. You will keep the cash. We will all agree, privately and amicably, that this was the right and humane decision for everyone involved. She named the sum. The sum was so large that Wren felt the breath leave her body in one cold gust. Cordelia Halloran patted her arm. Take a few days, she said. I am sure you will see reason. She walked away. Wren stood under the awning, alone in the dark green dress, with the city loud and indifferent around her, and she did not cry. She did not move. She thought about her brother and his school shoes. She thought about her aunt's swollen feet. She thought about the letter from the property management company which had been followed, in the month since, by a second letter, and a third. She thought then about Henry's small face in the photograph, and about the way Adrian had said, would you say his name? Please, just once. And she thought, with a clarity so cold and so bright it almost hurt, that there were 2 kinds of women in this world. There were the women who took the money, and there were the women who did not. And Wren Mackenzie, 26 years old, daughter of a woman who had died too young in a bed too narrow, sister of a boy who slept in a bunk bed in a cracked apartment, niece of a woman who had cleaned other people's houses for 30 years and had still never, ever, sold one piece of her dignity, had been raised by all three of those women to be the second kind. She walked, in her green dress and her tired heels, out from under the awning, and she found Adrian by the curb, and she put her arm through his, in front of every person standing on that sidewalk, and she said clearly, so that anyone who wanted to could hear it, "Take me home, please. To my apartment, where I live with my family." And he did. She told him about the offer the next morning. She told him in his kitchen, sitting on a tall stool at the marble island in his penthouse, while he scrambled eggs with the careful focus of a man who had only recently learned to scramble eggs and was determined to perform the task with dignity. She told him in flat sentences, without embellishment, without performance. She told him the sum. He set down the spatula. He did not turn around. For a long moment he stood with his back to her, his shoulders very still, his head bowed slightly toward the pan. Then, very quietly, in a voice she had not heard from him before, he said, "She is my mother, and I love her, and I will never, for the rest of either of our lives, forgive her for this." Ren watched him. Adrian. He turned around. His eyes were dry, but his face was so tired that she could see, suddenly and clearly, the man he was going to be at 60. "I am going to call her tonight," he said. "I am going to tell her, with witnesses, that she is not to contact you again, and that she is not to attempt to negotiate the terms of your presence in my life ever again, and that if she does, she will lose access to me entirely. I will be very calm. I will be very polite. And I will be very, completely, irreversibly clear. Do you understand?" Ren nodded. "And then," he said, "I am going to ask you something. Not today. Not this week. Not until I have been the kind of man, in this kitchen and in that office and at every fundraiser between here and Christmas, who has earned the right to ask it. But I want you to know now, in advance, that I am going to ask it. I am telling you that I am going to ask it so that you have months, if you want them, to prepare your answer. I do not want to surprise you. I do not want you to feel cornered. I want you to have, from this morning forward, the full and considered freedom to know what is coming and to think it through, with your aunt and your brother and yourself, and to decide what you want, on your own terms, in your own time, with no pressure from me at all. Do you know what I am telling you?" Ren's chest was very full. She nodded once. "I know," she said. "Good," he said. He turned back to the eggs. He served them to her on a plain white plate, with one piece of toast slightly burned at the edge, and one piece of bacon that had crisped a little too much. She ate every bite of it. It was the best breakfast she had ever eaten in her life. He drove her home himself afterward. He met Theo at the door. He shook her brother's hand, gravely, as if Theo were a man of consequence. He sat at her aunt's kitchen table for an hour, drinking instant coffee that he had never in his life had a reason to drink, and at the end of that hour, her aunt Imelda, who had not been impressed by a single man in 30 years, looked across the table at him and said, in her dry, careful voice, "When you marry her, I expect to be the one who cooks the wedding food. None of this catering business. The cooks will be from this kitchen, or there will be no wedding." Adrian Halloran, the most powerful real estate developer in the city, nodded once, very gravely. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "If she has me, the food will be from this kitchen." Imelda nodded back. Theo, who was 7, said, "Are you going to be my brother?" Adrian thought about this very seriously. "I would like, very much," he said, "to be your friend first, and then, if your sister allows it one day, to be your brother. Is that all right with you?" Theo considered. "Will you bring more coloring books?" "I will bring all the coloring books you can color," Adrian said. "Then yes," said Theo. Imelda hid a smile in her coffee. Ren, on the other side of the table, looked at the three of them, and felt the room go warm around her in a way that no rich man's penthouse had ever made her feel. 6 months later, in a small church across the street from her aunt's apartment building, with 32 people in attendance, and the food on the buffet entirely made by Imelda and 3 of her sisters, Wren Mackenzie married Adrian Halloran. She wore the same green dress she had worn to the fundraiser, because she had not been raised to throw away good dresses. She wore her grandmother's silver comb. She walked herself down the aisle, because there was no one in her life who had the right to give her away, and she had already, herself, given the part of her she was willing to give. Adrian was waiting at the altar. He cried. The new senior community liaison from the Henry Halloran Foundation, a young father from a family the foundation had served, conducted the ceremony. Theo was the ring-bearer. Imelda did not cry, but at one point she pressed her hand very hard against her own mouth, and that was almost the same thing. Cordelia Halloran did not attend. She had not, in the end, accepted that her son was building his life around a woman in a green dress from a sample sale. Wren did not have the energy to be wounded by the absence. She had her family. They moved, eventually, into a building Adrian owned. But they moved into a regular 2-bedroom unit on a regular floor, not the penthouse. Wren refused the penthouse. The penthouse, she said, was where his old life had lived. They needed a place that had never been anyone's life before. They got Theo into a good school in the neighborhood. They paid for it, themselves, out of Wren's foundation salary and Adrian's regular paycheck. They did not touch the family money. They lived, by the standards of Adrian's world, modestly. By Wren's standards, they lived in a kind of careful, watchful abundance she had to talk herself into, every morning, by reminding herself that her brother now slept in a room with a window that did not look out onto a brick wall. The foundation grew. It grew because Wren built it from the inside the way she had built everything in her life, by getting up at 6 in the morning and showing up and asking the right questions of the right people in the right rooms. It grew because Adrian, for the first time in his life, was allowed to say his son's name out loud every day in front of strangers without coming apart. He still cried at certain anniversaries. He cried on Henry's birthday every single year, on the floor of his office at 1:53 in the morning, and Wren, who knew, would always go to him, and they would sit together 10 feet apart on the carpet, and she would say, in her voice that was steady and soft and warm and absolutely her own, the name Henry, and he would cry, and breathe, and breathe, and rebuild. Years later, after their own daughter was born, and they named her Mackenzie Henrietta Halloran, after the boy and the woman whose name had carried him through the worst night of his life, Wren would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and walk to the window and look out at the city he owned so much of, and she would think about the woman she had been on the bus that night, with the property management letter in her back pocket and her hand throbbing where she had twisted it on a mop bucket. And she would think about how thin the line is in this world between the people who have everything and the people who have nothing. And she would think about how, sometimes, all it takes to cross that line, in either direction, is to be the person willing to stop in a hallway and listen, just for 1 second, to a sound on the other side of a door. If this story moved your heart tonight, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone you love. Every story we tell here is built around a simple idea, that the smallest kindness, offered to the loneliest person, in the quietest hour of the night, can rewrite an entire life. Stay with us. There are more stories coming. And as always, thank you for listening.